Chapter 3. Strike the deepest blow. She loved the child stirring within her, even as she nervously pressed the accelerator, pushing toward Paris, straining to think of another lie to explain the birth that would soon be evident. She loved the child, loved it because it was Maury's, and she had loved Maury, if only she hadn't had to ruin it. But she must have a story, an explanation for the family and the friends and the wagging tongues of Paris. She must have a reason for the expanding abdomen that would soon force her out of her clothes and into the smocks of maternity. She bit her lip and squinted down the highway, although she was not watching the road. In her mind's eye, Alice could see her mother's face, only slightly clouded over after so many years of heartache. She could see her sisters turn their heads from side to side, considering her story, wondering. And as she could play the scenes with the various neighbors already in the theater of her imagination, the hypocrites would nod their understanding as they faced her, then sneer and giggle and lash out harmlessly as she walked away. As the miles of pavement slipped away beneath her old car, Alice took the elements of truth that best produced lies and assembled her fable. I met a wonderful man in Michigan. Yes, Alice, they would say, or yes, Amy, from the ones who had known her the longest and still called her by her evangelism days nickname. But of course, those overnight courtships never worked out. No, Alice, of course not, they would say with less credibility in their voices. And we were divorced last month. Oh, Alice. Oh, Amy, we're so sorry. Then I found out I was pregnant. This was a line that would tell all. Tell whether they bought it or not. She could tell by the narrow passage of time between her words and their response. If they failed to respond quickly enough, she would know her story had not held up. In the narrow passage of time, the tiny sliver of silence after she revealed her pregnancy, she would always know whether she had assembled credible details, or whether there was too much reasonable doubt in the known facts, that she had only been gone a very short period of time, and that no one had heard about this marriage back in Paris, and that she was coming back undeniably pregnant. But the story, Alice realized as she wheeled the auto onto her old street, would have to do. It was all she had to go on, absurd or not. She called herself Mrs. Blair, something that she felt gave her a reasonable amount of respectability. Mrs. Maury Blair. The name sounded fine to her. But the story, she could tell each time she told it, was not being swallowed by the wagging tongues of Paris. No one laughed at her face, which was no surprise, but the gossip mill was heavy laden for weeks as Alice's pregnancy became obvious. Cyrus was waiting for her, open-hearted, and by all appearances, content to wait in the wings of her life. He meticulously pursued a comfortable, active social life, making her feel womanly, when by other standards she would not. It was a sexual investment for him, charms that would pay off later, he hoped, when this pregnancy was out of the way. But she sensed an anger, somewhere deep inside him, about the earlier rejection, and about the child she was now carrying for another man. Certainly by her own standards, she did not feel womanly. Inside, Alice was in tumult. The old desperation clung to her, like syrup. She could not get away from it. The money problems were worse now than ever. She did not feel well much of the time. The children were irritable and reckless. The house was a disaster. Some days, as she sat with her stomach before her, the child kicking relentlessly, Alice longed to see Maury Blair again. She had become engulfed in his warmth that summer, and now as the Canadian leaves went dry and brown and bland all around her, she missed him. There was not the same love for Cyrus that there had been for Maury. Maury had been, by the warped standard of her life, a real love. And yet she knew, even as she pined, that she had lost Maury Blair. Forever. On some days she felt the strain would be unbearable, and yet she always awoke the next day, bearing even more. And she grew bigger still, heavy with the child of a man she truly loved. A child she somehow hated to be having under these awful circumstances. There was no money for a hospital visit, so when the awful day came, Alice called on Zeke Virgil, the pool hall owner, to drive her to Brantford in Birch County. She could not ask Cyrus. It was somehow too unpleasant in Brantford, where destitute mothers had delivered many babies. It was not the kind of welcome Alice would like to give to the offspring of Maury Blair. In fact, She determined never to tell the child the truth about where he was born. But at least it was relatively safe, and she would be cared for in the crucial hours. He was a sickly baby, never comfortable in those early hours and days of life with the environment into which he had been thrust, a foreshadowing, perhaps, of future agonies. He seemed to absorb germs from the air as if his system in some perverse way required them to survive. Every bug came to live in his frail little body. Baby fat was quickly used up, and his arms and legs failed to flesh out. They looked like rails. Alice was dizzy with the pressures life had brought upon her, as she recuperated from yet another childbirth. Every new decision had to be weighed delicately against the mired backdrop of her past, and whom she had told what versions of the truth. Out of all this, she concluded that the new infant must be named after the man she had lied about marrying and divorcing. The baby would be called Maury Blair. But in her troubled confusion, Alice did not want to legally implicate the man she'd been loving when she conceived this baby. So she avoided confronting the legal requirement, registering the child to acquire for him a birth certificate. She did not want to list Maury Blair as the father. Because of this, although Alice had little understanding of the ramifications, little Maury Blair would have no legal existence. She came back to Paris with the sickly infant, and the old familiar stirrings returned when she saw Cyrus again. There was still that twinkle in him that told her he was accessible, vulnerable, a possibility. She was careful, cautious in her approach, and as they dawdled over a beer at the Paris hotel bar, they gingerly made their way through the tense necessities. Alice advising him what a horrible mistake the Blair affair had been, how badly Blair had treated her, even though she had not told the rest of the townspeople this. Cyrus resisted the notion inside, knowing better. But she was so coy in her appeal to him as they talked that he had difficulty measuring out the truth from the nonsense, so he nodded agreement. But Cyrus did not plunge in. He wanted to string her along a while, dangle her over the cliff for a bit. He loved the penitent, prodigal lover, returning to him on her knees, needing him so badly, so pitifully. And he could hang her. He could pour all the anger and humiliation out of the old rejection back into her now, the simmering, smoldering hatred within him, now many months in the making, could finally now in this perverse way find worthy expression. He thought about her weaknesses, the most vulnerable elements of Alice's fragmented life. He looked for a place to strike the deepest blow, to leave the wound that would not heal, but could only grow more painful. And he thought of the baby, Maury Blair. Her eyes always lit up just a bit when she looked at little Maury. He could tell she had reserved a special place in her heart for the child, and the thought of this infuriated Cyrus. It was clear to him that she still had a deeply rooted love for the man who had fathered the little bastard. Whoever that lover had been, he had found his way into Alice's bed in that long, humiliating summer of Cyrus's rejection. Cyrus thought about the child now, the living evidence of his own spurned affections, and he boiled silently with rage. Then it struck him that this situation was ideal. Now he could have his cake and destroy it too. Somewhere in the night, Cyrus Wick arrived at his sinister plan. "Oh, Cyrus, you can't be serious." Alice chided him a little nervously when she heard his proposal. Cyrus looked at her evenly, without any expression behind his eyes. "I am." Alice felt the flutter of worry in the pit of her stomach. She knew instinctively that he meant what he said. He would marry her, but she must get rid of little Maury. "Cyrus, he's just a child." Cyrus's face flushed and his nostrils flared momentarily. "I'm not going to father that little bastard," he growled, his face reddening as he spoke. "Let someone else mess with him. I'll take care of my brother's kids, and that's all." Alice fell silent, her heart pounding. She raced through the complicated details of her life. She desperately needed the financial security that Cyrus could bring. She could no longer hope to care for so many children with virtually no income. She knew she could not afford to unravel the relationship with Cyrus for any reason. But to give away her baby, Maury Blair's baby, the thought stuck in her throat. He was a narrow, frail little boy, nearing 1 year of age, and something about him brought a special responsive affection out of her every time she looked at him. His big eyes, his dark hair, so unlike her other children, so much like Maury's father. Alice took Cyrus's big hand and stroked it gently. She needed to diffuse the discussion for a while. She was sure Cyrus would change his mind with a little more time and a little more affection. Cyrus held fast. Days trudged into weeks, with the house and the children and the poverty and the squalor closing in ominously on Alice. She felt the cluttered rooms growing imperceptibly smaller each hour, the stench rising up out of the kitchen sink like a ghost. She relentlessly cultivated Cyrus, spending more and more time in his arms, prodding him with all her available charms to change the conditions he had established for their marriage. But Cyrus would not budge. The little Blair bastard would have to go. And the time Alice spent in her own house with her children became more and more a mockery of motherhood. She had no money, no resources, either financial or emotional, for caring for these children. And she had no hope of help for caring for these children. And she had no hope of help through Cyrus as long as the little black-headed bastard, Cyrus called him the black bastard, was in view. Alice fed the warring emotions within her by retreating into a mental fog. Deep in that fog, she could sometimes consider the horrible alternatives calmly. She wandered mentally through a dozen different plans, each one ending with Maury's disappearance. Of course, the provincial authorities could take him, although she had heard the horror stories about the wasting of little lives in that bureaucratic maze. More often, her mental meanderings took her to unreasonable extremes, with the scenarios of desertion and murder. There were certainly many ways to kill a tiny child. She imagined sometimes that she could actually do it. One day she wrapped the baby and headed for his birthplace, Brantford. Alice's sister Isabel lived there. They would visit for a couple of days. Alice needed to escape at least for a little while. The house stood in a rural setting, with fields all around. Alice said she was going to take Maury and go for a walk. Isabel puttered around the house until Alice returned, with the sun setting and the air turning cooler. The baby was not with her. Isabel, sitting at the kitchen table, looked up at her younger sister sharply. Alice only looked at the floor and muttered about the weather and the next day's meals, then sat down at the table and sighed heavily. The room fell silent. "You can't do this," Isabel finally said softly. "Where is he?" Alice could not answer. Her eyes were glazed and blank. "Alice, I won't be part of murder," Isabel said, with urgency in her voice. She slid her chair away from the table and stood up. "We've got to find him." As her sister headed out into the fields, Alice sat alone at the table. Her head was swimming with pictures of Cyrus, the other children, the wreck of a house back in Paris, then with pictures of Mr. Maury Blair, and the innocent face of the helpless infant she had left in the high grass, no telling how far away. She stood up and shuffled to the kitchen counter, leaned against it wearily, and waited. She could not tell whether to hope Isabel would find him or hope otherwise. Her stomach was slashing inside her. It could be an accident. No one would ever know. It seemed like hours later that Isabel pushed open the back door and, carrying the shivering child, wrapped in her shawl. Isabel's face was creased with lines and patched with red from the cold, but she had nothing to say to Alice. Calmer the next day, Alice returned to Paris with Maury. Alice struggled with the new child and with her other children to keep some semblance of order, or at least avoid outright chaos in the cramped house. The air hung in the house like a heavy cloud with the slightly unpleasant odor of an unkept place. A naked, dingy light bulb poked through the ceiling in each room, casting everything in the flat, harsh yellow of 60 weak watts. Cyrus's ugly offer stood. The bills piled up. The pressure continued to mount in Alice's mind. Inevitably, she fled again, this time to London, Ontario, still resisting Cyrus's mandate to give Maury away. In her flight, she became pregnant a fifth time, a pregnancy draped in secrecy to this day. The new baby, Mark, was born in Alice's despair. Sickly Maury, meanwhile, was registered as a patient in the same hospital, under treatment for multiple illnesses. Years later, the hospital record books would reveal that the infant Maury Blair was visited by someone who signed in as Mr. Maury Blair. The visitor's actual identity may never be known. Alice languished in her unhappiness, feeling bewildered and pitiful. She knew where she would have to come to rest, where she would finally have to settle if she was to keep life from consuming her entirely. She knew she would have to return to the drab, ugly past. Little different, actually, from her drab, ugly present to Paris, to face the townspeople one more time, to see the hard-edged Cyrus Wick, and perhaps negotiate an arrangement of some kind with him. After all, with Maury a little healthier now, perhaps Cyrus would reconsider his harsh decision. She felt the need to mend, to take some time and just heal over. She had been ripped and shredded and hurt too often. It was telling on her. She was only in her 30s, but she felt old. She thought about Cyrus. Could she love him in spite of what he was demanding? Could she build a relationship on the slim thread of affection they had felt? Sometimes she mused it was possible. Once again she hobbled to Cyrus. She lamely asserted that her flight to London had been unnecessary and indeed therapeutic, but Cyrus snorted with derision. She was not her old smooth self, able to lie with finesse. She was a beaten, troubled woman, and Cyrus, sensing her desperation like a lion preying on a wounded zebra, raked her mercilessly from one concession he required. If he wanted him to rescue her from all this, if he wanted him to marry her and father her children, the black bastard must go. Alice struggled not to explode in tears, for she had had too little strength left. She caved in and cried with anguish. He was killing her. But her life had taken such perverse twists and was by now so horribly distorted that she could still at least consider his awful counter-proposal. In some moments of the far-fetched imaginings, it seemed so senseless to strangle her own life and the lives of her other children, for the sake of this one scrawny little boy. If she could only bring herself to give up this one, all the others would be taken care of. It would be so simple to put that distance between herself and the cause of her problems, little Maury Blair. And the problems were mounting, even as they seemed to be bulging towards some cosmic limit, some boundary beyond which no one person's problems could ever mount. As she looked out through her jaded eyes, she saw an unreal world. Life shrieked at Alice every moment of the day, through an unreal haze, with every blink of her eyelids, with every simple action and reaction. She felt herself being jabbed and prodded continuously, and her mind swirled with images of disaster. She had to get relief. She had to get some peace. She had to get some help. She had to get Cyrus Wick. Who else would have her? Who else would ease the pain, dissolve the trauma? Sometimes as she tried to pull together her swarming thoughts, she boiled the conflict down to a single, simple option. She could either give up Maury, or she'd go completely mad. She accepted the offer as they nursed beers in the bar one evening. "I'll do it," she whispered. He looked at her. He grunted. "I'll let Maury go," she said softly. Her eyes shut tight against the sound of the words. Cyrus was silent for a moment, then exhaled noisily. "Well, see that you do," he said, looking away with a caustic nonchalance. "We'll get a marriage license tomorrow." Alice sat motionless, suspended in sadness. She swallowed nervously and wondered if she would really do it.